Coach Vance here, Senior International Olympic Weightlifting Coach and Professor of Sport and Exercise Science. This presentation is a simple guide to how fat burning actually works. This will help you kind of understand the difference between movement of fatty acids and fat burning, and it'll help us understand some of the rabid marketing of fat loss protocols, whether that be exercise or eat this food and it removes belly fat, or eat this food and it causes belly fat. We want to have a simple understanding of how it actually works and whether or not this actually leads to long-term fat loss is very nuanced. So if you understand kind of how it works and how it doesn't work, then you can better understand how to actually improve body composition versus just losing weight. So in the future, that'll be very helpful, and it's not going to go into kind of the deep chemistry, just kind of look at how complicated it actually is and how we can simplify things a little bit better. So fat burning is actually a three-step process. It starts with mobilization. The fatty acids themselves have to be moved from the adipocyte, the cell itself, into the bloodstream. It has to be transported, and it has to reach the mitochondria to be converted into ATP, a source of energy. So not all fatty acids that get released, mobilized, or even transported end up being burned. So that's something we have to consider as well. For example, you can do things that will increase fatty acid mobilization. Let's say you, for example, an easy demonstration is you just take some fat burners or stimulants, which might induce fatty acids to be released. You get that fight or flight response, but your body eventually says, it has a feedback loop that says, we don't actually need more energy. You're just sitting there typing on your computer or something like that. Our metabolism right now is still relatively low. So sometimes these fatty acids can be esterified, like they don't even enter transport. Sometimes they enter transport, but there is a feedback loop that says we don't need you, and it doesn't lead to fatty acid oxidation. So we typically need a combination of both fatty acid release and transport, but also an increase in metabolism as well. Mobilization is only the first step. The fatty acids can circulate in the blood, be restored back into the adipocyte itself, called lipogenesis, or other adipocytes as well. They move around and they enter back into your subcutaneous fat cells, or even your intramuscular triglyceride cells as well. So just increasing mobilization does not necessarily mean you've lost any body fat in a permanent manner. So here is the actual fat cell, an adipocyte, and you can see that it is essentially a gland. It's not just an empty bag full of oil, right? It's not a Ziploc bag full of oil. It has organs and it has mitochondria attached as well, so that you can produce ATP fairly quickly, but it can also be released into the bloodstream as well. And you can see here is all of your triglycerides stored, and when they enter the blood, you call those blood triglycerides, and your doctor might check for those. If you have high triglycerides in the blood, what that means is that you have an over-release of fatty acids into the bloodstream that are not being adequately used by the body, which leads to some metabolic dysfunctions. So the release of triglycerides into the bloodstream to be used as fuel needs a stimulus, right? And the main stimulus is actually epinephrine. For our US members, that is often called adrenaline, but the rest of the world, I think, uses the word epinephrine, which is the scientific term. And epinephrine stimulates an increased heart rate, so an increase in metabolism and movement. Right? There's other contributors like glucagon. So, for example, when your insulin is low, glucagon stimulates more fatty acid release. You're saying we have low insulin, we're not using a lot of glucose, carbohydrates, glycogen for fuel, so we need a fuel source, so that becomes triglycerides, which we'll get to. And those are released into the bloodstream mainly from what you would call a sympathetic response, an increase in fight or flight, an increase in heart rate. We need more fuel. Call to action. We need more fuel. It is also stimulated by hormone-sensitive lipase. They can release triglycerides from the adipocyte, and for example, this happens a lot while we're sleeping. At night, often stimulated by growth hormone, which again, when you're sleeping, you don't need a high heart rate. You have a low heart rate. You're not running in your sleep or anything like that. The main fuel source becomes fatty acid metabolism, kind of long and slow release. But your metabolism while you're sleeping is generally suppressed to a large degree. So it's not like you just burn up all of your fat while you sleep. That would be really neat. But you don't need a lot of energy, so your body says we don't need you. So you get some release of fatty acids into the bloodstream that are used for fuel. And if you are in an energy deficit, you actually will probably get some permanent or some long duration lose in body fat while you sleep. In fact, we have some studies that show people who get better night's sleep, sleeping 8 hours, 7 or 8 hours, versus people who sleep 4 to 5 hours, have a more difficult time improving their body composition. And that's probably because they're losing some of that fatty acid utilization while they're not sleeping. Fatty acids themselves, the transport and the use of fatty acids by the mitochondria, require L-carnitine. It's an amino acid that we get from our food, especially meat sources, very high in seafood, beef, that sort of thing. And also your body can make it, right? So that's why L-carnitine supplementation kind of goes through cycles of high popularity with this idea that if I have saturation, a high amount of L-carnitine, maybe I'll get more fatty acid transport and burning, which is true. It's very nuanced, and I'll actually do a video on L-carnitine supplementation in the future. If for whatever reason you have an illness that prevents or causes L-carnitine deficiency or use, it's kind of a total mess. You end up with a lot of health problems because you impair this fatty acid oxidation that is necessary, transport and oxidation. But it requires this shuttle, basically the L-carnitine shuttle, which moves it into the mitochondria so that it can be creating ATP from those fatty acids. The actual breakdown of fatty acids into fuel, into ATP, is a four-step process, and we are going to basically ignore the complicated chemistry of this. Just know it is a four-step process. Basically, hydrogenation, saturation in hydrogen, then oxidation, and then thiolysis, which ends two carbons which are attached to make ATP fuel. And here is the complicated chemistry that goes on. And again, it's not really important to understand this unless you want to work in research or in chemistry. You would want to understand this because, well, can we develop something? Can we create pharmaceuticals? Can we look at nutrition and all of this good stuff to see if how can we uh, improve this four-step process to beta oxidation, or how can, if you have an illness that causes a disruption in this, how can we essentially cure this illness or improve this illness so that you don't end up with all kinds of health complications that would result from an impairment in this process. So within your cell, you have all kinds of different types of fatty acids. Essentially the same fatty acids that you can get through your nutrition, your saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fats, and then all their metabolites, your omega-3s, omega-6s, and all of the acidic type of metabolites as well. So theoretically, for example, you can have a high amount of saturated fats in your cells or a high amount of polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats, and you can actually over a long period of time you can maybe even change the makeup. For example, you go on a diet or you increase your energy expenditure and you start to cause more beta oxidation, more fat burning. And previously, maybe you ate a lot of saturated fats, and now you switch your diet to more unsaturated fats. You can actually change the ratio between saturated and unsaturated fats within your cells. All of your cells, all these fats are probably necessary. They have a lot of important metabolic jobs in your body, so it's not like you want a zero saturated fat or a zero unsaturated fat. It's kind of controversial how much of each you need. Some people would say 1/3 of each is very good. Too much saturated fat can have implications with essentially with cardiovascular disease, for example, inflammation, that sort of thing, and these tend to be anti-inflammatory, and high amounts can be inflammatory. It's very complicated, but in general, if you want to be healthier, you can actually change the makeup of your actual adipocyte, because again, it acts like a gland. So if you're always releasing fat or saturated fatty acids into the bloodstream, can that have deleterious effects? Can that raise your LDL cholesterol and those type of things, which I'm not going to get into those type of debates, but just know that these can be changed over time. Your fatty acid metabolism and energy use has these four different sources, we'll call it. So not all of your fatty acid transport is going to come from your fat cells themselves, your subcutaneous under the skin, or your visceral around the organs, or your intramuscular fatty acids. It is also going to come from digestion as well. You eat a food source that has fatty acids, which most do, unless you're just drinking lemonade or something like that. Those will contribute to fatty acid transport and either lipogenesis, stored in the fat cells themselves, or used for fuel. And even your cholesterol. So if you eat like a fried egg or something like that, has a lot of cholesterol in the yolk, that can be converted into fatty acids as well, and vice versa. Fatty acids can be converted into cholesterol. Cholesterol is a very important hormone, and there's arguments that too much cholesterol, not necessarily from diet, that doesn't seem to be important, consuming too much cholesterol doesn't typically cause high cholesterol in the diet, but it can be converted into fatty acids and vice versa. Like I said earlier, your fatty acid release and oxidation typically requires essentially a sympathetic response, an increased heart rate. So you have these kind of categories here when fatty acids is the highest and when it is the lowest. And you have these beta receptors. Your beta receptors are all over your muscles and organs, and they use fatty acids for fuel. So the fatty acid transport increases when the beta receptors are essentially online. So you get beta oxidation, which is part of fatty acid oxidation. So they're the most active when your insulin levels are low. Because when your insulin levels are low, that means you essentially haven't eaten in a while, usually. Since we're not digesting food, since we're not consuming carbohydrates, we're not consuming dietary sources of fat, you need more release from the fat cells themselves. Most active when growth hormone is high. So if you're in a fasted state, your growth hormone is going to be high. So growth hormone is kind of misplaced the way people talk about it a lot. They say it's an anabolic hormone. Well, it depends on the environment. It's also a catabolic hormone. So for example, if your growth hormone was very high and you're consuming a lot of energy, its job changes. Typically, growth hormone is used for growth. Right? That's how that works. If you're in a catabolic state, like you're fasting, your growth hormone would be high, but your IGF-1 would be low. So it's not an anabolic state, it's a catabolic state. So your growth hormone is going to help release some blood sugar, but also your fatty acids as well to be used as fuel. So this is this idea that, fitness athletes, bodybuilders, and stuff like that will sometimes use growth hormone before they do cardiovascular training, for example, because it increases their fat burning and metabolic rate, theoretically. So most active during low, moderate heart rates. So we'll get to that. But when your heart rate is not significantly high, you're going to use more fatty acids for fuel than carbohydrates, glucose for fuel. Most active when epinephrine is high. Again, exaggerated heart rate. You need fuel for action. And highest during and after exercise. So during exercise, of course, you need energy. And then after exercise, you need an enhanced energy use metabolism, essentially for your body to have an immune response, for repair, and all that good stuff. And because typically you're essentially you've created an energy deficit. So we need more energy to, after exercise, we still need to move, we still need to breathe, we still need our organs to function. So we need energy there as well. And of course, highest when blood glucose is lowest, right? So if you've ever had a low blood sugar type of environment, you feel awful. That's because basically blood glucose is not supplying your body to make ATP. So if you wait long enough, your body will start going, whoa, we need energy. You'll start releasing fatty acids for fuel to kind of correct that deficit in metabolism. Also occurs during exercise because over a prolonged period of time, your blood glucose is supplying fuel. That'll get a little bit lower. You won't be able to keep up with your exercise, and you'll start using more fatty acid. So we don't want to be in this, at least according to your body. Your body doesn't care much about your abs. It cares about keeping you alive, keeping you functional. So you have a feedback response. So you also have your alpha receptors. And your alpha receptors' job is to suppress beta oxidation, right? So we needed fuel at this time. We need less fuel at this time. So now my alpha receptors are active to suppress all of this. So they suppress beta oxidation. Highest when insulin is high, essentially means you're eating, you're digesting. So body repair, body energy storage. We need to store energy. we're no longer using high amounts. Highest when growth hormone is low, which usually means you're resting. The exception there, of course, is when you are asleep. Your growth hormone will be higher. Highest when heart rate is high as well, can suppress beta oxidation and use more an immediate faster fuel source like muscle glycogen and glucose. Highest, of course, before exercise because you're not actually in that sympathetic response. You don't need a lot of energy. And highest when blood glucose is also highest. So this is why, for example, people with insulin resistance, diabetics who have high blood glucose all the time, they suppress their fatty acid oxidation, and it leads to impairment in having a great body composition. So a lot of times you'll see when somebody with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance starts taking medication to deal with their blood glucose, then their fatty acid metabolism improves. And a lot of people, when they start taking these medications, for metformin, for example, is one, you'll see a few pounds of weight loss, usually initially, acutely, because they've improved their blood glucose, and then their body starts using some more of their belly fat, for example, for fuel. So the main beta receptors that use fatty acid transport for fuel is your beta 3. It's responsible for lipolysis, breakdown of fatty acids into ATP. You have them all over your organs. You can see here a lot of your beta 1 receptors are in your heart. It increases your heart rate, your urination, increases the kidney function, start filtering. And your beta 2 receptors are in your lungs, your blood vessels, your GI tract, your uterus, your liver. And then you also have your beta 3 receptors, which are on those lipocytes, those adipocytes. So, for example, if you have asthma and you take asthma medication, asthma medications, they're getting better and better. They are more selective to the beta 1, beta 2, but especially those old school asthma medications like clenbuterol, for example, are less selective, and they essentially increase activation in all of your beta receptors. So that's why clenbuterol is popular with athletes and physique athletes and people who want to lose body fat, because it stimulates this lipolysis as well. But anytime you start exercising, increase heart rate and whatnot, you're going to stimulate all of these beta receptors, which will lead to fatty acid transport and metabolism. So now we want to look at how exercise actually plays a part in fatty acid oxidation, and maybe there's ways we can do different forms of exercise to stimulate this to a greater degree, and we'll look at does that even matter in the long run. So obviously physical activity increases epinephrine, which induces that fatty acid metabolism. Exercise intensity, carbohydrate oxidation increases fatty acid oxidation, decreases fatty acid oxidation as well. So that basically the higher intensity uses more carbohydrate for fuel, and I'll get to that. As duration of exercise increases and carbohydrate availability decreases, so you burn up some of your glycogen and glucose, fatty acid oxidation increase. It's highest rate at about 90 minutes of constant motion. So that would be like your moderate to low intensity cardiovascular aerobic style exercise is going to be the highest at 90 minutes. So duration probably plays a bigger part than the actual making sure you're in this perfect intensity zone. So fatty acid oxidation is higher during submaximal exercise. So basically, on average, between 42 and 75% VO2 max. And the reason why there is this kind of big difference, so 47 percent versus 75% is because there's lots of individual variability. So, and that could be due to fitness level, that could just be genetics, that even gender plays a role in that. So some people will have a higher fat burning at 65. There's outliers that will be up to 80%. So if you look at individual studies, you can scatter plot where each individual is on this range, and they're like all over the place. But in general, there's an average. All right, so you can see the highest here is a little bit less than 65%. So you would see more of a scattering towards the middle here, and then you would have your outliers and that sort of thing. So how well trained you are and all that good stuff skews those to a great degree, even your diet. You would think that obese individuals would have lower fatty acid oxidation because you'd say, like, okay, kind of the chicken or the egg thing. If I have very poor fatty acid oxidation, that is the reason I am obese. But that doesn't seem to hold true in the literature. And the reason is because, well, obese people have an abundance of calories. They tend to overeat above energy expenditure. And so they have this big giant fuel source called their fat gut there that allows a lot of energy to be used in the form of fatty acids. So a lot of times they have actual increase in fatty acid oxidation, but because they are overeating, they also have greater fat storage. And diet, the relationship between obesity and diet might also play a role in that, right? So they might be consuming more fat calories than the average person, or maybe not. Maybe they're consuming more carbohydrates, but any fatty fat that they consume in their diet will be more likely to be stored anyway. On average, females tend to use a little bit higher amount of fatty acids for fuel than males. There's a few different hypotheses, reasons why this could be a thing. One is just more estrogen. Estrogen seems to mediate fatty acid oxidation. And I think this is kind of shown in a crazy study where they took some male cyclists and they gave them an estrogen patch to wear starting, uh, a few hours before they actually hopped on the exercise bike. And when they were testing, the placebo, so people had a blank patch that wasn't releasing any estrogen, and the other group had an estrogen patch, their fatty acid metabolism increased. So if you weren't worried about changing your gender by taking estrogen, if you're a male, you could wear an exercise or an estrogen patch and increase your fatty acid oxidation. But the side effects of that is probably something you don't want. But in general, women have higher fatty acid oxidation, but they also tend to store more body fat anyway, essentially needed for the metabolism, the creation of estrogen, the storage of estrogen, and allowing them childbirth and menstruation and all that kind of stuff. But women achieve higher fatty acid oxidation during the follicular phase of their menstrual cycle, and then achieve more fatty acid storage during the luteal phase. So it tends to be washed. There's other theories. For example, some females have higher amount of oxidative fibers. Right, so they're going to use more fatty acids for fuels because they have more type 1 fibers. And then on average, males have more type 2. Of course, you have different populations of males and females. You might see that go away if you compare female athletes to male athletes, like power strength athletes would probably be very equivalent because that is selective, population selective for that phenotype. So aerobically fit trained individuals just oxidize more fatty acids during high intensity training as well. So So for example, if you're untrained, you might get a lot of fatty acid oxidation at 60% VO2 max, but you might be 75% VO2 max if you are very aerobically fit. That could just because you have higher numbers of aerobic type muscle fibers like type 1, but also your body gets more efficient at using fatty acids for fuel because that's the way you're training. You get adaptation. You do aerobic training, your body gets better at burning fat for fuel. But we also know that well-trained individuals oxidize more fat during rest as well. Nutritional status also can change the amount of fatty acids you use for fuel as well. The highest being if you're in a fasted state. So if you get up in the morning, you hop on a treadmill or something like that, go out for a run, you're going to burn a higher amount of fatty acids. The idea of fasted cardio doesn't seem to hold water with natural athletes. So people who are not using some type of medication to increase the fatty acid oxidation. When you compare fasted cardio versus fed cardio, in the end, you don't see more weight loss or changes in body composition because overall, it really mostly depends on calories, the amount of fuel, right? So you can eat carbohydrates before you train, and that energy will be available. And then when the energy is not available, you're in a deficit, you will use more fatty acids. So it tends to become a wash, hypothetically. But there's only been a couple studies, so it's not something I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's proven that fasted cardio can't be superior. When you throw drugs in the mix, like growth hormone or stimulants and those type of things, that might change as well. To my knowledge, there isn't great studies on that because, well, it's hard to get approval to give people types of drugs before they do exercise, right? So the body also tends to adapt to the macronutrients you give it. You eat more fat, your body is going to get more efficient at using fat for fuel. Eat more carbohydrates, your body is going to get more efficient at using carbohydrates for fuel as well. So this idea that a low carbohydrate diet automatically means it's superior for fatty acid oxidation. That is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean you will have long-term fat loss. Why? Because you're eating fat as well. So you get more fat storage because you've consumed more fat. It really comes down to energy in, energy out, despite what some of these quacks will tell you. Alternating substrates before training acutely affects oxidation. So if you eat more carbohydrates, you'll suppress your beta oxidation to a small degree. It doesn't shut it off, though. Obviously, if you consume a bunch of fat right before you train, you'll probably increase your fatty acid oxidation, but you have more energy in general for storage when you're done training. So you can drink some coffee with some MCT oil and you'll increase fatty acid oxidation, but you're supplying your body with fatty acids, so it doesn't lead to any greater fat loss over the long term. So low carbohydrate, high fat diets show the greatest potential for elevated fatty acid oxidation, which might be a consideration if you're like an ultra endurance athlete. That doesn't require a lot of high intensity, but overall, it doesn't seem to make a big difference in body composition if there's any difference at all.